My mom is an avid collector of fiesta ware. Fiesta ware it's a pretty simple pottery that's in all sorts of colors. I think they have almost 50 colors that they've released. So you have to collect every color, which is actually, now that I'm an adult, I think it's kind of cool. We go over to my mom's house, and every one of my 5 kids, they can eat off their favorite color plate. And there's a beauty in that diversity on my mom's table, right? But as a kid, the most exciting thing about my mom's dishes was what was inside my mom's dishes, especially when we're hungry, right? So we'd spend a lot of times at garage sales and at antique stores because they've been making these plates for a long time, and my mom was particularly looking, she liked these medium green ones that were apparently quite rare. And so she wanted us to be excited about them too, and she would give us a finder's fee if we were the first ones to find the fiesta ware and these mounds of other dishes that were in the store. You had to be at the right place at the right time. And it did make it pretty exciting to the point where even today, if Becca drags me to a garage sale, I find myself flipping the dishes over to see, is it fiesta ware? And that's pretty cool. You know, you find a deal, you happen to be going to the park when they're already having a big party and you just happen to show up, you're at the right place in the right time. That's pretty easy. But sometimes we have opportunities that present themselves and they come with a certain amount of risk. That's the story we're going to be looking at today in Esther. I had a similar situation. When I was younger, I was working at a soup kitchen, helping out at our church had a soup kitchen that met there once a week. And afterwards, I was talking with one of the gentlemen, we'll call him Bert, and he was actually a pretty good cook. He'd cook at the soup kitchen, but he was also relying on the soup kitchen pretty regularly as well. And I was talking to him, and I said, well, how are you doing today? And he said, well, not too good. I had my toe taken off the other day. And he didn't have a warm place to stay, and I realized I had a pull-out couch, and I was like, well, don't sleep out in the cold. You know, if you need a place to stay, you know, let me know next time. Well, you know, being 18 at the time, I didn't really think things through, and of course he needed a place to stay, and not just that night, but really every night, and so that's what he told me. And I realized the place I was staying, it was a shed. It was a very nice shed, about twice as big as the stage here. There was no plumbing. There was a bucket in the closet, and there was a bucket under the sink, if you know what I mean. And then there were 2 rooms. There was the room where I had my bed, and that was about all the space there was in that room, and then there was another room where there was a little couch that pulled out into a bed. And so I didn't have a whole lot of space, and I didn't know Bert all that well, and I realized I kind of had a decision to make there. I had an opportunity to be a real blessing to Bert, even with the very little that I had, but it was also, there was a certain amount of risk, right? We'll come back to that story later. But Esther is in the same situation. She has an opportunity, but it comes with a much greater risk as well. Now, Esther is actually a fairly long passage, and so what I have today is actually a summary that's put together by Pastor Landon McDonald. It's out on, I found it on YouTube. So it's going to go by pretty quickly. If you miss something, don't worry. We're going to have a link posted online, so you can go back and watch the entire video again if you'd like to. But this is, in about 3 minutes, Esther's story and Esther's dilemma. So one thing that's really neat about the book of Esther, because it's unique among the books of the Bible, there's only 2 books of the Bible where God isn't actually mentioned in the book of Esther. It doesn't say God, it doesn't give any other name for God, but we certainly see God working, God's providence throughout the book. And sometimes in our lives, it feels like God's silent, but those are opportunities, reminders for us to look for God's providence. Where is God putting us? What are the opportunities that God is presenting? And the other thing is, if you didn't catch it there, Esther really, she knew what the risk was. She knew that by going in to face the king, that there was a chance, he hadn't called for her in 30 days. There was a chance that he wasn't going to be happy to see her. And he didn't have any options. It was either he was happy to see her or she was going to die. Esther also had a special relationship with Mordecai that I want to draw attention to. Mordecai had raised Esther. Esther was an orphan, and Mordecai was Esther's uncle, and he had taken her in as his own daughter. He had been a godly father figure, instructed her in the faith, and been alongside her all the way through from the point of entering the beauty contest and going through and becoming the queen of Persia. Mordecai was there and checking in on her, looking for opportunities to give her advice and encourage her. And that comes to a head here in this moment where Esther has a big decision to make. Let's go ahead and, if you want to turn to Esther 4, we're going to be reading a couple verses here just to really highlight this conflict that Esther has, this decision that she has to make. So in Esther 4, verse 11, we read that all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, this is Esther speaking, I have not been called to come to the king for these 30 days. So this is what Esther is replying to Mordecai, as Mordecai said, you have an opportunity here. And Esther says, I've got a risk. I've got a huge gamble. If I even go to approach the king, that could be it. Esther recognizes that she has power and prestige, and she's comfortable in that position. But she also knows that she doesn't want to waste that opportunity. So check out Mordecai's pointed reply. Skip on to verse 13 where he says, "Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" I love that. Who knows? Mordecai isn't claiming to have any special guidance here. He's just saying, who knows? This might be the moment. But what he seems fairly certain of is that this is Esther's only choice. If she wants to be in the center of God's plan for her life, she needs to take action. This is the time. There isn't going to be another opportunity. There isn't another person that he's aware of that can take a decisive action. Mordecai knows that he can't go in to see the king. But then Esther's reply shows that she's been listening to Mordecai, and she gives him some direction. She says to Mordecai, "Go and gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. And I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king. Though it's against the law, if I perish, I perish." So again, the Bible doesn't say why Mordecai saw this as the only option for Esther. It doesn't give us a blow-by-blow of how Esther has processed this huge responsibility that she has. But there seem to be 3 basic things that are emphasized in her decision. One, God gives us opportunity in our lives. And God places us in community. And finally, God gives us purpose through these opportunities. Let's break that down. So God gives us opportunity. He can allow crises and suffering in our lives, times when we have to take risks, just like Esther did. But He uses them to fulfill His plans. That can be on an individual level, where He's working inside of our lives, and whether you realize it or not, God has been working behind the scenes in your life. It can also be in His broader redemptive plan for mankind. In Esther's crisis of faith here, I'm sure that she was wrestling with the idea, can she really be the person that can save God's people? I mean, it seems a little grandiose, right? To think that she's the only person that can act. And Mordecai seems pretty clear on this. She's probably not. God probably has something worked out. If Esther lays down on the job, doesn't go in to see the king, God is going to provide for His people. But this is Esther's opportunity. The second thing, as she wrestles with this, she's trying to come up with a plan, right? She wants to hedge her bets as much as possible. She wants to make sure that if she comes to the king with this request, that she's really thought things through. There's no sense in just running in and just saying the first thing that pops into her head. There's a thoughtfulness, a very pragmatic nature that she approaches this with. But finally, is the price worth it? Is the risk going to be worth it? Her life for everyone else's life. So she demonstrated great faith and courage in trusting Mordecai, and she embraced his confidence that God was going to come through and rescue his people, but she also recognized that there were no guarantees. And this is where I think that Esther really shines. And a lot of times we look at how good Mordecai was at supporting Esther, but then Esther turns things around and she gives direction to Mordecai, and she reminds him that it's not just Esther, it's not just Mordecai, that there's a community of Israelites that are going to be affected and that need to be involved. She recognizes that second point, that God gives us community. He places people in our lives to guide us. Now, by way of example, I was mowing my lawn this week, and I had to borrow Norm's lawnmower. And I didn't tell Norm this, but I've never actually driven a lawn tractor before. And Norm was busy giving me all the hints and tips on how to get the thing started. It's almost as old as I am, the lawnmower. It's a nice John Deere. It still works just fine, Norm. I didn't damage it. But we got into this place where Ike, my oldest son, he was helping me. He would move the things out of the way as I was driving along. But he said, "Dad, why do you keep getting stuck?" And I realized that the thing that I'd forgot to ask Norm about was, see, my dad, he was a big fan of grasshopper lawnmowers, and those are a zero-turn lawnmower. They're not like a lawn tractor. They turn very easily, they get around obstacles, and I kept finding that I wouldn't turn quite as sharp as I was used to, and I really needed some advice on how to get that lawn tractor through the yard. And Ike and I, we kind of muddled through it. We formed a little community of like-minded people who had no clue what we were doing. And that we got through. So no damage done to the lawn tractor there, Norm. But in simple things, I think that we're good at asking for help. And we need to remember to do that in spiritual things. We need to remember, even when the pressure's on, that we need our community. We need the people that God has placed around us. But Esther does such a good job of that. Mordecai had done a good job of raising Esther, and he's the one who recognized the opportunity, but Esther's the one who said, hey, this has got to be more than just me. We need God's people praying. So Mordecai challenges Esther. Esther challenges Mordecai. And in our lives, we need Mordecais. We need to be Esther. We need to be like Mordecai, and we need to support one another. We need to ask people for advice. We need to be willing to step in and do that. Who are the people in your life that you're allowing to influence your spiritual decisions, your life decisions, those big opportunities that God places in your path? Do you have a spiritual father or mother like Mordecai? And if you find that you are a Mordecai in someone else's life, are you willing to be like Mordecai and accept the direction of those people that you've been guiding? Getting back to my story about Bert and my offer that was perhaps not entirely sincerely given, because I didn't realize how much I had on the line when I offered for him to stay with me. I was thinking, if it's a really cold night or something, but as soon as he replied, I knew that he had a great need and that I had an opportunity to fulfill that need. And so what I did, I was renting this little shed, and I went to my landlord, who was also a friend and a believer, and I said, okay, you know Bert, and you know the space that we have. How can we help Bert through this? Because I want to do something for him, but I also want to do it wisely. And so he said, well, from what I know of Bert, we need to lay down some guidelines. And the first thing is, he just needs to know that if he's going to be in my shed and share this space with you, that he's got to keep away from alcohol, because that was why Bert was in the position he was, and we need to help him hold to that. And so we sat down with Bert and we talked to him about what the requirement would be to be in that space. And it was a great opportunity. For one thing, he was a really good cook, and I can cook a few things well. At the time, I think it was macaroni and cheese and frozen pizza. But after about 2 months, there was a point where he fell off the wagon again, right? And so again, I found myself going back to my friend and saying, what do we do? And so we went and we confronted him. And it was difficult to say, because it was a little warmer this time of year finally, but it was still, we were kicking him out on the street. We helped him move his things, and he wasn't happy. I don't think that I could have done that without the help of my friend. And a few months later, I heard through the grapevine that Bert had finally cut ties with the community that was so toxic for him. And he'd gone to live down south with his oldest daughter, and that he'd finally cleaned things up. That taste of freedom from alcohol was enough for him to realize that he needed to make some changes. And so it was an opportunity, not just for Bert, because he was able to get his life cleaned up, but also for me to see God working that way and to be a part of God's plan. It's a privilege. We need to do that with God's people. See, when we get to participate in God's plan for our lives, God gives us purpose. The third point there, God gives us purpose. He has a plan for my life. He had a plan for Norbert's life. He has a plan for your life. And he had a plan for Esther's life. You can see it wasn't just this one moment, but God had put Esther in a position each step along the way, not only that she would have this opportunity, but that she would be prepared to make the most of this opportunity, that she had the people around her that she needed to navigate this decision, to navigate this responsibility. As we look at our own lives, God has specific plans, certainly, but first let's consider generally. I think that God has a plan for each of us here today. He wants us to love Him. He wants us to, through that, know how to love others well, to obey God. In other words, we have an opportunity to follow Jesus. And as we follow Jesus, we have an opportunity to reach out to others and let them know what it means to be loved, to be loved by Jesus, especially that perfect love that Christ has for us. We get to practice that love on others. God might be working on your heart this morning about something specific. It may be that God has a plan for you. And you know those details because they've been weighing on your heart. He's given you a passion. Maybe it's to join the team going to Haiti. Maybe it's something as simple as signing up for the Fresh Start that we have this week, joining our group and handing out lunch boxes, showing people that they're loved, that they're important in this community, that God has a plan in their life through something as simple as giving them a pencil and taking time to talk with them. Whatever God's general will or specific will is for us, though, it's so important that you know that God wants us to be a part of His story. And God has planned a place for you in that story. God is going to put you in the right place at the right time. And there may be a risk that's associated with that. But it's worth taking. The thing is, sometimes, especially as we look at our place in the community, the church isn't perfect. And maybe you've been in a position where you felt hurt by the church, by God's people, where you felt like you've been let down. And I know I felt that way. There was a time when I really felt let down by God's people. I'd had a lot of friends move away. I had others that seemed like they weren't following through in the promises that I thought they'd made to me, and I got bitter about the church. And with time, I realized that bitterness, I'd allowed that in part because of my own immaturity, that I was expecting more of people than was really fair or right, that I had unrealistic expectations, but I'd allowed that bitterness to drive a wedge between me and the church, and in doing so, I'd stepped back further and further from what God had called me to. And I found myself in that position that I felt like I'd made a mistake, that I was separated from what God had wanted for me, that somehow that I had to do something to make that right again. because I knew as much as I'd been let down by the church, that I had also let down God, that I hadn't followed through with the plan that God had laid out for me in my life. And I thought because of my mistakes, because of my sins, that I'd have to at least, you know the saying, God helps those who help themselves. That's what I was trying to live out. If I helped myself a little bit, because I knew I couldn't be perfect, but that I needed to gain God's attention, to gain His approval. But I want you to know that that's not a true saying. We can't put off for tomorrow what we can't get done. We can't do enough to earn God's favor. Obedience to God starts with just saying yes. Yes, Lord, here I am. I'm not much. I'm made mistakes. I've got my brokenness, my own issues. But such as I am, here I am. And Lord, I want to say yes to the opportunities that you've placed in my life. My wife and I had gone through a period of prayer, and we were considering the position we were in, and we realized that we needed to start saying yes. And as soon as we did, God started opening up new opportunities for us. Not opportunities that were maybe exactly what we thought God would do. They weren't the things that we started looking in and opening doors because we knew that we needed to start taking some action. And those things never panned out, but God would open up new opportunities that helped begin to transform me, helped begin to get me back onto the path that God had for me. God's plan for our life, you don't see it unfolding until you actually surrender your life. It's not going to fully engage until you've surrendered to Jesus and you've said, yes, Jesus, I want to be your follower. And here's why. The Bible tells us that if we break God's law on any point, if we make any mistake, that it's as though we had broken all of God's rule. That's James 2:10. And yeah, we can do a lot of good things without Jesus. There's a lot of good people who don't know Jesus yet. Because God is at work in our lives, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. But the Scripture says in Hebrews 11:6, and it is impossible to please God without faith. Anyone who wants to come to Him must believe that God exists and that He rewards those who sincerely seek Him. It's not about pleasing God through our works, about pleasing God through making good decisions. First, we have to please God by having faith. And God helps provide us with the opportunities and the tools that we need to start making better decisions. It's not a chicken or the egg thing where we don't know which one comes first. Faith always comes first. And if we want to maximize the good that we're doing in this world, if we want to really serve our communities, we do it by first starting with faith, by allowing Jesus to work in our lives. Because He's already there. He's already trying to call us to Himself and already trying to help us be more like Him. And when we turn things over to Him, it's like if you're in the driver's seat of that lawn tractor and you just said, you know what, Jesus, show me how it's done. Take over. Romans 8, verses 8 and 9, Paul writes, that's why those who are still under the control of their sinful nature can never please God. But you are not controlled by your sinful nature. You are controlled by the Spirit if you have the Spirit of God living in you. And remember that those who do not have the Spirit of Christ living in them do not belong to Him at all. If you want to belong to Jesus, it starts with saying yes. If you want to be in the right place at the right time, it starts with saying yes to Jesus. So our take home for today, we've got three things that I want you to remember. God gives us opportunities. God gives us community. And God gives us purpose. We have opportunities every day in our life. And so as you go through this week, I want you to look for those little things. Even if it doesn't seem like God is just pulling at your heartstrings, look for those opportunities that God opens up. Look for those chances to send an encouragement out to the Chalus, to get involved with the Fresh Start, to text a friend and say, hey, I'd like to pray for you today. Even in the midst of crisis, we need to keep our eyes open for those opportunities. And the way that God has designed the church to work is that we will see those opportunities best when we're living in the community that He has placed around us. We need people in our lives who are giving us good, godly guidance. People like Mordecai, who will invest into our lives. And if we're going to allow people like Mordecai to invest into our lives, if we can find a Mordecai in our lives, someone who has their eyes fixed on Jesus, we need to also be the sort of people that can be a Mordecai or an Esther to others. That we can reflect Jesus into the lives of others. And that sounds pretty daunting. It sounds like, I can't be Jesus. And you can't. You can't be Jesus. But I was at a conference once, and someone was presenting on leading family devotions. And a big football player, he's also a pastor, and he said, men come up to me all the time and they say, I don't know the Bible. I can't lead a discussion in my family. And he said, the thing is, you just have to stay one page ahead of them. You just have to read your Bible. You just have to be open to the wisdom that God has. It's not about imparting your wisdom and your expertise. It's about reflecting what God is doing in your lives. Are you willing to put in the time to be a Mordecai, to be an Esther? Look for opportunities to gain God's wisdom, to gain some knowledge from God this week by looking into the Bible. Start maybe by reading the Book of Esther. And finally, I want you to know that God has purpose for you. That if we take action on these little opportunities that God opens up for us, and maybe it's a very small opportunity this week, those oftentimes lead to bigger opportunities down the road. And you get to see God's plan unfolding in your life. You get to see that you have a place in the plan that God has to save His people, the people here in Medicine Hat, that He wants desperately to know the love that Jesus has for them. And you get to see God work and transform your life and the lives of the people that are around you. Not because we're so special, but because we say yes to the opportunities that God puts in our lives.